Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scaling GraphQL APIs with Apollo Federation. Let's just let some folks join for a minute before we jump into our content for today. My name is Eve Porcello. I'm joining you here from Tahoe City, California. Good morning. Good morning. Where is everybody else joining from today? If you ever have any questions, comments, anything, feel free to drop those in the chat. I will get to those as soon as I can. Good stuff. Awesome. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started then. We are here today to talk about scaling GraphQL APIs. We're here to talk about how do we work with GraphQL really at scale. So Linda, great to see you. Hey, from Austria. That's awesome. So very excited to have you all here as well. Nice. So basically, before we get started here, I want to thank the This.Labs team for having me here today. That's always a pleasure to work with that great group. Also, thank you to StepsN for sponsoring this event. So I'll share some content a little bit later today about how StepsN is awesome, and we should all check them out. So let's talk a little bit about GraphQL at scale. Before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of the GraphQL parts, I want to talk a little bit about scaling in general. A great representation of scaling is this scale cube. So down here in the lower left-hand corner represents kind of the least scaled version of an application. So we're talking about one application running on one instance down here in the lower left-hand corner. And then we go all the way up to the upper right-hand corner where we have the most scaled version of an application. So we're talking about multiple instances, we're talking about a database that's broken up into different pieces, or we're talking about microservices, or perhaps we're talking about all of these things all at the same time. So when we scale along the x-axis, we're talking about scaling instances. When we scale on the y-axis, we're talking about scaling microservices. And when we scale on the z-axis, we're talking about scaling data. So we're talking about partitioning our database, breaking it up into different pieces in order to kind of handle different parts of the app. So these are all of the different vectors we can think about when we're talking about the scale cube. So that's kind of lofty stuff. Maybe that doesn't make sense. One way that I think it makes a little bit more sense is to talk about it in a little bit of a metaphor, to talk about an advice booth. So let's say we have an advice booth here. We have a person who's really, really good at giving advice. And the advice that's coming in is going to be given to anybody who comes to this advice booth to receive it. So all these different people are asking the same advice booth for that same information. One way that we could handle the traffic at this advice booth would be to create separate advice booths for different people to go to. So we hire more staff. We have more people giving out this advice. So this would be scaling instances. We would create different versions of the application. It's the same thing, but these instances would then be able to handle additional traffic. We also could run these instances as multiple instances on a single machine, or we could put all of these instances behind some sort of a load balancer and then put these instances all over the world. So we could have different data centers all over the globe. Let's talk a little bit about scaling data. So here we got our records manager. This is the person who's responsible for handing out all of the information from the database. Now, these different records, we're going to ask for different records for our data. Everybody's coming to the records booth at the same time. One way that we could break this up is we could say, hey, why doesn't everybody with the last name A through K go to one section? That'll be one database, L through P in another, and Q through Z in another. It breaks down the kind of onslaught of this information. And then finally, we have kind of the way we describe this as horizontal partitioning. So we're breaking down our database into different chunks. All right. So finally, perhaps the most important, not most important, but maybe most popular way to do this is to create different microservices. So here we have our advice booth. We're trying to handle all of this traffic. And one way that we could break this up is to break it up by topic. So we have finance advice, love advice, wellness advice. Of course, the wellness advice booth is going to be the most popular one. But as our application scales, we have different microservices for different pieces. And if one gets too busy, we can even break that microservice down into different instances. So we can scale on multiple axes at the same time. So this is our last piece of the scale cube puzzle. We're breaking down these microservices for different parts of the app. Okay. So most of the time when we're talking about an application, kind of the approach that we used to take a lot of times was to create a monolith. So oh no, can you hear me now? That's no fun. Let's try that. How are we feeling now? Hopefully you can hear my voice. I was trying to make sure you saw a little better. Okay, cool. Cool, thank you all for that. I appreciate it. My goal is not to have you not hear me. So let me roll back a little bit. So awesome. So yeah, we here on the slide have different, we're basically breaking down, let me take it back for a second, our monolith into different microservices. So these different microservices can be interacted with by different teams. So we have a team for shows, for theaters, for search, for checkout, for customers. And then what's cool about this microservice architecture is it allows us to swap out different pieces of the app for third-party services. So we have Stripe for all our payment processing. We have Auth0 for all of our authorization and authentication stuff. Everything is handled by a different piece of the puzzle. We don't have to interact with the whole thing anymore. So you may be thinking, Eve, I thought this was a workshop about Apollo Federation. And it totally is. The way that we want to think about our GraphQL API, if you are newer to GraphQL, this is kind of what this flow of a query looks like. We send a query to a GraphQL server that lives here in the middle. And then the GraphQL server is going to collect some data from wherever it is, whether it's a database, a REST API, a cloud service, whatever. And then it's going to deliver this information back to us in a single response. So this is the flow of a GraphQL request. We, from our clients, will make a request to a GraphQL API. That GraphQL API will collect some data and then return that data in a single response. Now, this is where Apollo Federation comes into play. So Apollo Federation is a slightly different style of architecture That's going to allow us to send a query not to a single GraphQL API, but to an API that sits in front of a bunch of separate APIs. So let me show you what I mean by this. Our query is going to be sent to a gateway. The gateway will then collect information from the appropriate GraphQL API and then deliver it in a single response. So here's what's really cool about this. The whole purpose of this is because different pieces of the app can handle different parts of your API. So we might have an account service API. That account service API will have a whole team devoted to that service. We also have a color service and a review service. Each different piece is going to handle a different part of the application. Each different team is going to be responsible for just their part of the app. So this is the whole idea of the gateway. We want a single location where we can send a request, and we should be able to get that data back in a single response. Now, what's really cool about this will allow us to maintain different schemas for different parts of the app. So previously, we might have a user, a product, a review. Now we're going to think more about how a different schema should just be related to users. Our team should manage a schema just related to users, or products, or reviews. And then we're going to extend different types to fit into those products. Okay. So this is kind of the breakdown of how that API works. But what I really want to do is actually try it together. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to share a couple of resources with you. I always like to share these a little bit later in the class so that we can make sure that everybody gets the information that they need. So let's go ahead and pull this up. This course that we're going through today is going to be about 90 minutes or so. So we have about another hour and change, but it's part of a longer format class. So I want to share with you the link to these resources. Those are always up for you. And what I'd like for you to do, and the slides are here too if you need them, federationslides.html. There is a ton of information here for you to check out. But why don't we take a second here to just download these files? You can clone them to your desktop, you can download them, and we will start from there. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to get that going. Once you're done, you can hit me with a thumbs up in the chat if you want to. That'll let me know that we're ready to move on. But I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to download this with you. I'm just going to clone this. I guess it's there already. I'm going to make a directory and put it in there. I'll call this August 3rd. And then we'll clone it there. Awesome. And then once I'm in there, I'll go into Federation Nation, and then I'll run npm install. And then I'll open it up in VS Code, and I'll remember, now I remember, that we're actually going to have to run some of those installations in some different folders. Okay. So yes, I will trust these authors because most of those authors I know, and we'll roll over into Zen mode. And once you're ready to move on, you can just hit a +1 or a thumbs up or whatever you want. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and take a little tour of some of these files. And we're going to go through the process of kind of seeing how one of these GraphQL servers is put together. So if you need a little more time to install that stuff, that's totally fine and expected. But let's go ahead and jump into this. So what we want to take a look at is the Snowtooth API. Inside of this Snowtooth API, we have a gateway, and we have some lifts, and we have some trails. So we can look at this here, snowtooth.moonhighway.com. This is where the kind of main API lives. Just to talk through kind of what we're seeing here, a GraphQL API often has an interface that looks like this. It's called a playground, and it allows you to send GraphQL requests to an API. So I can send a request for, let's say, all lifts. I'll grab a name, and I can send a request alongside this for some trail information. So think about a lift as being a little chair that takes you to the top of the mountain. Think of a trail as the way you get back down. So I can send a request for all of this data. There we go. And I should get back all of our lifts and all of our trails. So this is the kind of goal of what we're trying to build. But ultimately, when we're trying to create some sort of a GraphQL schema, we have a bunch of different types all together. And then our teams have to manage that single document. So what we can do with Apollo Federation is we can actually break down our teams. We can decompose our teams into different pieces so that they can handle different parts of the app. So back over to our Snowtooth API here. We're going to open up our lifts API. So we see our lifts API has lift information. If you're newer to GraphQL, a couple things to know about an Apollo server here is that we're going to create a schema that describes all of our API's types. And we're also going to create resolver functions. Think of resolver functions as being functions that return data from wherever it is. So this is what that lifts API looks like. And you want to think about a whole dedicated team of folks who just work on this API. We also have a trails API. So the trails API is everything having to do with these trails. I love that people are adding the +1 or the thumbs up. It's happening. Sometimes it takes a while to install stuff. Last night I was teaching and it took me so long to install anything. It was really sad, but it all worked out. So this trail is going to give us the information about how we get down the mountain. And this type will just be organized by that group. So that team is going to focus on that. Okay. All right, now, next thing's next. We want to open up our gateway. Now, inside of the gateway, we see a package JSON file that has a couple different things, but not too much is in this folder. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to create in this folder a new file called index.js. And we want to make sure that that's in the gateway folder underneath Snowtooth. The gateway is responsible for taking both the lifts files and the trails files, both of these APIs, and standing them up behind the gateway. So let's actually first take a step to run this thing so that we can see kind of the differences between the two. I'm going to move over to the lifts folder. I'm going to run an npm install. I'm going to open up a new tab. Oh, that's cool. That's a new interface I haven't seen yet. And we're going to run the trails. So here we'll change directory into the trails. We'll install all the dependencies. The dependencies that I'm installing here, let's talk about that. Apollo Server, GraphQL, and NodeMon. So all of these are going to help us handle building this server. Okay, so all those dependencies are installed. All of our Lyft dependencies are installed. The next thing I need to do is I need to make this a federated API. So this is kind of a fun thing, right? Along the way too, if you have any questions, stop me. Go ahead and drop those in the chat. You're never interrupting me ever. So please do take a minute to ask me any questions if they come up. What questions do we have at the moment? Okay, cool. Well, keep those coming if you have them at all. Don't hesitate to ask. All right, so the first step of making these APIs federated APIs, yeah, I'll move on. I always like to, and let me put my face back on the screen. When I'm teaching in person, I like to stare at the class and make sure that no one has any questions, but I don't think anyone does. So fair enough. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, inside of the lifts index file, we're going to make this a federated API. So we'll go ahead and close this for the moment. And we're going to make some changes to this to make this work. Okay. Okay. So the first thing I need to do, well, inside of our lifts project, I need to install @Apollo/Federation. So @Apollo Federation is going to be the package we need for all of this. Then inside of our file, we will say const build federated schema. And then we'll require @Apollo/Federation. So why am I incorporating this package? Why am I creating a federated API at all? Well, this is going to allow me to create an API just for Lyft data. This Lyft data I'm going to make available to a gateway. So if we look back at this example before, typically our APIs, our GraphQL APIs look like this. We have a single GraphQL API in the center. We send it queries. It sends us back some data. This time, though, we're going to create a gateway so that our users, our clients, anybody consuming this data can send a request to a gateway right here in the middle. But that's going to pull together information from, and we could replace this with lifts and trails. This is going to create kind of two sub-graphs, sub-APIs that live behind the gateway. So we'll still be able to send a request to a single place, but we'll pull that data from a couple different places. Really good question. Thank you for that. So now that I have that installed, and I have the build federated schema function pulled in from Apollo Federation, we're going to scroll down a little bit. Now, anytime I create a GraphQL server, we're going to create it with a list of our type definitions, our schema definitions, and our resolvers. But when we want to build a federated schema, when we want to build a federated API, we're going to actually set this up a little bit differently. We're going to add a key called schema. That's going to be set equal to build federated schema. And inside of here, we'll have our type defs and our resolvers. So essentially, we're just nesting this inside and making this a federated schema. Okay. Now, I'm going to run, let me make sure that I have a start command in my package JSON. I do. So when I run npm start, I should be able to see this running on localhost 5001. So let's go ahead and run npm start. This fired this thing up over at localhost 5001. And this is going to open up everything inside of Sandbox. So Sandbox is this tool that Apollo gives us to send queries to this API. So a couple things going on here. The way that I know that this is a federated API is, notice we have this query that's built in here called underscore service. Underscore service has a field on it called SDL. That just stands for schema definition language. So everything inside of this SDL is going to be our full schema. So this is pretty cool. So this just means that the gateway eventually, the service that's going to collect this data about lifts, it's going to be able to pull it from this query. Awesome. So that's step one. The next step is we need to do the same with our trails. So we're going to go through the same process again, this time with our trails. We're going to run npm install at Apollo/federation. I'm going to drink coffee while that installs. And then we're going to go ahead and add those things that we need here. So we'll say const build federated schema. Set that equal to at Apollo/federation. Next things next, we want to, again, make sure that we have our server constructor set up correctly. So let's go ahead and add it here. Schema build federated schema. Then we'll pass in our type definitions and our resolvers into this space. Cool. Now if I run npm start down in the bottom, it should run this on localhost 5002. So now go to 5002. We're going to say query your server. This looks like we have that underscore service thing there for us, and that's going to return this huge blob of SDL, this huge blob of schema for us. Awesome. So far, it doesn't look that exciting, but exciting things are happening in the background. What we've been able to do is we've created two federated services. So we've created two services that can be orchestrated behind a gateway. Those are all fancy words of just saying, I want to be able to send a query to one place, to one sandbox, and I want to be able to get all the data about trails and about lifts. So, cool. Let's go ahead and make that work. So for now, I will stop this server I'll stop this. I'll clear that out. Yeah, so you may see that if you're using import statements that you're getting an error. So the reason for that is because we're using this in Node.js, we need to use require statements unless you set up Webpack. So what you'll need to do, and I'll share this here. Yeah, just add that. I know. Not as fun as using import statements. I totally get it. We could set up the project to use import statements, but that would take a little more time. Yeah. Good call, everybody. No worries. We're so used to using those import statements that, of course. All right, cool. So we got our trails, we got our lifts. It's all happening, everybody. So what we want to do next is we created that index file inside of the gateway, and that's really what I want to use next. Now it'll be our job to set up our Apollo server and our Apollo gateway. So inside this index file, and remember it's here underneath gateway index, this is where we're going to build the location where all of our requests are sent. So it's about to get really fun if it hasn't already. A couple things we should do. First things first, I started typing, but really I should be installing stuff. So let's go ahead and install Apollo server. We'll install GraphQL, and we'll install @Apollo/gateway. So I will copy and paste this into the chat as well. Sometimes you are getting that error about localhost 5001 and 5002. Another thing to try, sometimes I'll see that in a certain browser, our preferences aren't set up to allow that. So you could try a different browser, see if that works. And if that doesn't, just let me know and we'll figure something out. Okay, so once those things are installed, and if you're having trouble running it, do try to open it up in a different browser. Sometimes that helps. We're going to set up our gateway now. So we'll say const Apollo server equals require Apollo server. And then we also want to set up an Apollo gateway. The next thing we'll do is we will create the gateway. And all the gateway is it's sort of a directory, it's sort of a list of the current services that are running. So for my app, I have two services, right? I have the lifts and I have the trails. So within this gateway constructor, we're going to add a service list. This will be set equal to an array with a name, lifts, and we'll describe the location where this is running. So we'll say HTTP localhost 5001. And then here we'll say trails localhost 5002. All right. It's all happening. So we're just listing out what are the services that are running so that you can consume their data. Now from here, what we'll do is we'll create a start function. The start function is going to do the following. So we'll say const server equals new Apollo server. It should take in a gateway. And we'll say subscriptions are false. Let's see. So earlier, Luis asked, how do we manage context authorization in PubSub? PubSub is used for subscriptions, right? So in a traditional implementation of a GraphQL gateway, subscriptions are not supported. So we wouldn't have any PubSub stuff going on at all. However, you can kind of work around this. So I will share a link with you to a talk by Mandy Wise from Apollo, which is really great. It talks about how you would sort of make subscriptions happen on the gateway. As far as context stuff goes, we would use this in the same way that we would use context in any other circumstances. We would supply context to our resolvers, and then we would just collect that information where it's appropriate to. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, but more often than not, you're going to see all of this stuff happening on each individual service, but anything that both services need to know about, you could put on the gateway. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, let's go ahead and call server.listen. And we're going to listen on a specific port. We'll call then on this so that we can see which port this is running at. And we'll say console log. The Snowtooth is going to get too long. Give me 1 second. Gateway is running at URL. Okay. Let me just leave that up there for a second. I know that's a lot of typing. Now, if you are typed out, if you are not happy with the amount of typing going on, something you can always do is you can select from one of these solutions, and there's various versions of this so that you can scroll through and find the finished code. So always be aware of that. You can jump to any one of these branches to find that information. Interesting. So it says, I got the GraphQL Windows 5001 and 2 in Safari and got the connection error in Brave and Chrome. Yes, super weird. So we used to have a GraphQL playground that looked like this every time we fired up one of those Apollo servers. Now we're using Studio for this instead. I'll show you a few things about Studio in a bit, but you may see some cross-origin problems with this. So don't worry about it. Just try it in a different browser. Okay, I'll go back to this now. Cool. So at this point, a couple things I want to do. Number one, I want to start this server. I want to call the start function. I also want to, if we look at the package JSON here, take a look and see that there is a start script for port 5000, which is going to run nodemon here. So let's do it. A couple things we need to think about. We need to run both of our services first. So I'll say cd lifts. I'm going to run npm start. So this will run this on localhost 5001. Then I'm going to run our trails. So that'll run localhost 5002. Then I'm going to open up a third one. I'm going to get into the gateway. The Snowtooth gateway. And then I'll run npm start here as well. It says nodemon isn't found, so I'll say npm install just to make sure everything is installed there. I think I forgot that. And then finally, we'll run npm start. This should run the gateway on localhost 5000. And this is pretty cool. So localhost 5000. And a couple things going on here. The location of our endpoint is here. So here we have it at localhost 5000. We also have all of our queries here on the left-hand side of the screen. So we are seeing that this schema, if we click on the schema tab up here, this is going to give us everything about our lifts and our trails. So we did it. We combined the data from both places. A couple things about this awesome tool called Sandbox is that, number one, they're going to fire up an example query for you, but you can use the query builder so that you don't have to type the whole thing out. Over here in Playground, we had to do a lot of typing, a lot of troubleshooting about how to best handle this. So what we can do here is, let's say I want to send a query for all lifts. I'll just click the plus. Then I can ask for any fields inside of this that I want to, like ID and name. Then I can go back and I can add all trails, ID, name, and status, for example. I can change the name of the operation name. So I could say huge federated query. Now when I click play, it's going to collect data from our lifts and from our trails. So think about a huge team. Let's say we have, I don't know, 100 developers working on a project that uses a single schema. We could manage everything via a single schema, but a really cool way to break down our responsibilities as a team and to scale out our teams is to perhaps break down our project into different pieces. So we might have a lifts team. They're responsible for the lift application, the lift API. And then we have a different team for our trails API. But at the gateway level, for our clients who are sending these queries, they're just going to send a single query for all of the same data. So this tool here is pretty awesome to be able to view this stuff. You can look at it as a JSON response or a table response. You can download the data, all sorts of cool things that you can make use of using Apollo Studio and using Federation. All right. What questions do we have? It just got pretty quiet. Okay, cool. So if anything comes up, do let me know. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of these other projects that are listed in here. Oh, let's see. There's a great question. Can you mix Federation? Cool. Can you mix Federation and a regular GraphQL schema on the gateway? So the typical pattern that we'll use is we will have a gateway that collects data from various services. So you probably would never, not probably, you wouldn't have a schema at this level on the gateway level. Instead, you would say, let's create a list of all of the services that this is implementing. Maybe there's a review service, or maybe there's a, I don't know, an employee service or something like this. Everything is going to be listed inside of this service list and collected all together. So that's a really good question. Typically, the architecture looks like that, and that just keeps the responsibilities of the various pieces of this app really separate. All right, it looks like there's an error. npm start. Yeah, as far as like a slow migration path goes, I think you don't have to do everything all at once with this, but typically our gateway will just be responsible for orchestrating those services and then pulling in different pieces. There are different ways of doing it though. The kind of predecessor to federation was something called schema stitching, which a lot of folks found a lot of value in until federation came along. But there's a ton of different resources for the best ways of kind of implementing this stuff and rolling it out. So I want to share some of those with you. There's some documentation that really goes deep on what the gateway looks like, how do clients interact with them, and then the various subgraphs that are these other backend services. So I'm going to share that with you here. There we go. Another thing that I should note about Federation is this Studio tool that we've been looking at today. Not only is this good for sending queries inside of the browser, but it's good for managing other things as well. So let me pull up Studio really quick. I need to log in. Somehow I got logged out of almost everything today. So if you go to Studio apollo.graphql.com, Studio can be a paid service, but isn't necessarily a paid service. You can use it for free for lots of different things. If I look at a list of some of my APIs here, like our Snowtooth API, for example, not only does this give us the entire schema to work with, as well as the Explorer to send these different queries, but it's also going to give us information about the different fields that are being used, how many requests are coming in for these fields. It gives us information if you have the service for your different clients. It gives you metrics about how long it takes for these services to, I think I need to switch over actually. I think this is my paid account. It is. So this will give us information about how many requests are coming in. This looks a lot better. If there are errors that are coming in. So sometimes one of our clients will be sending queries that have a ton of different errors in them. And you can sort of track these things down. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like there's a promise rejection error trying to run npm start. So a couple things to look at with that. Make sure that you have both of your services running. So you want to make sure you have the trail service running on 5002. You want to make sure that you have the lift service running on 5001. And you also want to make sure that you have the gateway running on 5000. And I would check if there's a promise error, this start function. So I'm going to paste this big, long start function into, that looks really bad, but I'm going to paste that in there anyway. Okay, cool. Make sure that you have the syntax correct with this function because promise errors probably have to do with the dot then or something like this running incorrectly. Okay. Let me know how that goes. Okay, so regardless of where you are in that process, if you still have some more troubleshooting to do, we will take care of that. And we're also going to pull up our student file for a moment. So what we've been able to do so far is we've been able to set up our Snowtooth API. The Snowtooth API put both of our lifts and trails behind the gateway. So if you need to check out the solution, you can. You can go to the Solution 1 branch, and I believe this will give you, yeah, everything you need for that. There's also a complete solution here, and this will give you a little bit more info about authorization and authentication. So if you're interested in taking this another iteration forward, this is a shorter workshop together today, but you can take this another step to authorize a user. So I will share this link with you in the chat so that you can take a look at that. Awesome. And then we also want to point out that if you wanted to go through the process of building the account service, the color service, the review service, all of that can be done here as well. There's some instructions here for where those should run for those gateways. So feel free to check those out as well. All right. So let me grab my slides, get those back up and running. Just out of reach, just beyond my grasp. All right, so we've gone through a lot of talk about scaling and federation. The question then becomes like, when do I actually use this stuff? When is this important to make use of? Well, the real answer to this is you can use this at any point. So you can decide to start out your project with federation built in, or you can decide to incorporate this stuff later after after you have decided that your project has scaled enough. So either one, totally up to you. So here's what I want to do. I want to point you in the direction of those student resources. I want to, let's see, point you in the direction of those Apollo documentation pieces. I also want to thank the This team as well as StepZen for hosting this amazing event today. If you haven't checked out StepZen yet, it's basically a way of putting a GraphQL layer over any sort of database. So any data source you can grab, you can take advantage of the benefits of GraphQL to make this work and stitch together a bunch of different backends. So definitely check out StepZen if you haven't already. Check out all of the amazing this.events. So I'll say this.labs. They just do so much for the community. So I hope you can check out some of those events as well. Okay, I'm going to drop that in the chat. I'm going to drop StepZen in the chat. And that is the end of our official content for today. I know that some folks were getting stuck. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to follow up with me over email. I'm going to drop my email here in the chat. It's eve@moonhighway.com. I'll blast that out on the screen right now. Anything that you ran into issues with, any questions that you have at all, please always feel free to share those with me today, tomorrow, 5 years from now. No statute of limitations on any of that. Always feel free to share with me. As far as next steps go, I would encourage you to check out some Apollo resources about incremental adoption, about migrating entities and fields. All of this stuff is in your slides. Let me get my email address off the screen. And I want to just encourage you to keep in touch. So if there's ever anything we can do to support your work moving forward, always feel free to get in touch. So with that being said, aside from the troubleshooting of the promise rejection, I think we'll take that offline together to work on that. Does anybody have any other questions before we break? Thank you, Annie. Thanks for joining us from St. Louis. Thanks, Mohammed. Awesome, awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing you at a future event. Stay in touch and have fun working with GraphQL. Thank you so much.